Okay, so we're going to look at Daniel chapter 11. And in Daniel chapter 11, we have the prophecy that had been we've been preparing for in chapter 10. Chapter 10, the angel appears to Daniel. We've got this revelation of the impending revelation. The angel basically says, is coming, and he is getting this deeper and deeper understanding of the things that God has planned. So, Miss White had left this up here for me. This is something that she had kind of put together. I read through it just real quickly, and it looks almost identical to the things that I've got in my outline for what's happening here. What you have in chapter 11 is broken up into two sections, basically. The chapter 11 verses 1 through 36 is a very detailed account of the things that are coming in the Israel's near future. And by near, I mean it's going to everything that's going to unfold for them beyond their lifetime, but as things are going to happen to them over the next few centuries. That's a long time, but I mean near in the sense that it's right then is about to start happening. And then the second half, those following verses, 36 to the end, kind of universally agreed that these are things that are going to happen in the future. I think when we get there, you're going to see that the nature of these prophecies change and becomes much more of the kind of readings we get when we look at Revelation or other places. So, oftentimes prophecy is criticized because of its vague nature, right? It is talks about someone who's going to come to power. It doesn't really tell us who that is. And it talks about them conquering, large areas over, abstract numbers of time, right? And so we criticize it for its lack of clarity. So with that, we get to chapter 11. You want to know why this section of Scripture is criticized? It's too accurate. Not joking. The criticism here is that this becomes so accurate that the historians have said, nah, this was written after the fact, and they plugged in all of this stuff because they already knew the answers. Which is interesting to me because some of the history that we're talking about here, we are able to put it together because our archaeologists over the last several hundred years have been able to collect the data, decipher the scripts, and put together a history book, a timeline, all the things that make it understandable to us. You have to move yourself back. If somebody is writing this, and we're talking about like the year 100 BC, 200 BC. If somebody is writing this in the year 200 BC, they have zero archaeological resource to go back and verify the who's, the what's, the when's. Not going to be there for them, right? And so the criticism of it being too accurate, therefore it was written after the fact, it would have been very difficult to write this kind of material after the fact in 200 BC. Now, you and I, with Google and the internet and Wikipedia, you could put this all together. We would be capable of doing that because we have tons of resources available to us. That would not have been true back then. It would have been so incredibly difficult to put this together in this way, to have the timeline be this accurate. So it, to me, becomes even greater evidence of the fact that this had to have been prophecy that comes from God. So that makes me ask the question, when God is able to give us prophecy that is so precise, does that mean that God is in control of all those things and He's just kind of set a clock into motion and it's just this mechanism that is going to fall in place? I mean, He's already laid it out, so He just, it's just kind of all of the dominoes hitting one to the next. It's already set in motion and you can't change it?
Yes.
Okay? So we have no control really over our lives then? We're just waiting for God to... He's already decided we'd fall into election that way, Luke.
He knows everything about us. He knows the choices we're going to make. And no, we don't.
Well, I think there are examples in the Bible where clearly, he told Ahab he was going to die, and then God went back on that. There was some example about how they killed Tyre with the sun on the steps,
Okay, in Hezekiah's life. Yeah.
and the sun goes backwards.
Okay.
There are plenty of examples where he changed his mind.
Yeah, there are times we definitely want... Okay, Lewis?
But my deal is he knew he wasn't going to die anyway. He knew that Ahab was going to, you know what I mean? He knew. You know, it was not for God.
So we don't have any... So again, I come back to this. So we don't really have any control over anything we're doing. God's already planned it for us?
I don't know about planning. He knows our choices.
Now, we have control over what we do, but he knows what we're going to do. He knows what I'm going to do at 11 o'clock tomorrow,
Okay.
if I'm alive.
So and the reason I'm pressing this is that some people will say that this is evidence that God has already pre-elected, determined how things are going to fall out, which is not the truth. It's just that he already knows how everything is going to play out.
But that doesn't mean he's going to wind us up or program us like robots, and
Right.
we've got to do this. We still have the choice.
Yeah.
The freedom of choice has always been on the shoulders of the persons.
And, you know, I studied for a while. I studied physics in college, and I got deep enough into it that we started looking at our world, and physics has a hard time explaining some things when you really get down to it. It wants to be real simple, but then physics start getting into some of these things, and you don't have good answers for some of the things that happen on world. And what we understand about that is that time is relative, as we understand it. That theory of Einstein about the time and space are relative. God's ability to be any place allows him to be at any time. And he stands outside of that. And so it's this thing that all of that is related, and that God has the ability to see all of it at once. He sees the whole picture. And so as he gives this, these are given to show us his understanding of what is about to take place. And you would say, well, why doesn't God impose himself in some of these situations? Because what we're going to find is something's going to be bad for the Israelites. Historically, these things are not going to go well for them. Again, for us, it's nice with the 20/20 hindsight. We can look back, and all of these things are going to lead us to the time that we see beginning in the New Testament with the arrival of Jesus Christ, and all of these things are being set in order for all of that to take place. It is given to verify God's sovereignty over all of the world. Okay? So, let's do this. We're going to hit these verses. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the history. This would be one of those things that if some of this historical stuff becomes interesting to you, I encourage you to go back and look at some of these things. And I think there's a wealth of information in these chapters, or in this chapter, about some of the historical things that are going on. So, what we're going to do, like I say, is just hit a few of these verses as we run through here, and we're going to look at the historical connection, and they're kind of going to jump on next to the next and next. Verifying the facts would be something that it would way outside the scope of our class, but if you want to go back and start looking at these things, it's very interesting, but that's not what we're going to try to do tonight. So, chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, and then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. And as soon as he becomes strong enough in his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. All right, so this starts with Darius, who is the current king. We're going to have 4 kings that follow. From about 529 to 522, you have Cambias. And then in 522 to 21, you have Pseudo-Samiridas. You have then following him Darius Hypostasis. And then following that one, you have Xerxes. Xerxes is the one that I'm probably most familiar with. Xerxes is the one who does become the strongest of all of these, out of all these kings. He has the largest empire, and he is the king then that does try to go and invade Greece. So, completely failed campaign. If you watch the movie 300, this is the story of King Leonidas going to the Hellespont and is able to, with 300 Spartans, he defeats the army, nearly defeats them. That's a historical thing that takes place. We also know at the same time the Grecian naval fleet, which should have been destroyed by the Persians, stops them in the straits and is able to keep them out. And then by the time Xerxes has spent all his time at the gates, the Grecians have mobilized a force and they come back and pretty much destroy his army. From that point on, though, Greece was angry with the Persians. And so the last part of that, where it says in verse 2, it says that he will rouse the whole empire against the realm. That's when Alexander starts to come to power, and Alexander the Great expands his kingdom, and one of his specific goals is to go and take over the lands of the Persians because they had tried to invade Greece.
Xerxes is the king during the Esther story, right?
Yeah, and this goes to the Esther story, end of Ezra. So Ezra chapters 4, 5, and 6, and in the story that we have in Ezra, that all seems to line up with we're talking the same time period right there. Okay, so our other biblical documents verify these same stories with what's going on here as well. So you have a lot of connections, a lot of historical documents that are supporting all of these things right here. Okay? All right. So, that's verses 1 and 2. Chapter 11, verses 3 and 4, it says, And a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority, and do as he pleases. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. All right. So Alexander the Great rises to power. He dies in Babylon at about the age of 34, 35. So fairly young man. Some theories are that he literally drank himself to death.
Isn't he the one that's fat and wet because he had no more worlds to conquer?
That's what he said. And
And he did it in 4 years.
Yeah, he was. I mean, it was an amazing campaign. Alexander the Great took over a massive land at that time. Right? What they thought was really the world that they wanted to conquer, because they felt like beyond what they had, there wasn't much there. So it included Egypt, and includes Greece and what we call Rome today, Mediterranean. That Mediterranean loop around the sea there, pretty much have all of that. It extends into Israel, Syria, what would be modern day Iraq and Iran, across all of that, into Afghanistan. All of that was his. He conquered all that. He sat down, literally, just kind of sat down in Babylon, and like Laura said, he said, I've conquered the world. It was at that time by far the largest kingdom. And so he dies at the age of 34. He's got some small children, but really not a game plan to turn over the kingdom to his children. They're slain, and 4 of his generals slice up his kingdom. 4 points of the compass, the 4 generals take over, and they slice up his kingdom. Lines up exactly with what happens in those verses. Probably already referenced in Daniel chapter 8, verse 8, where it says that he had been growing strong in his power, and as soon as he shall have stood up, his reign, and then he falls again. Right? So that's 3 and 4. So we got the Persians, we got Alexander the Great. Verse 5, Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one who is his princes, or who is his prince, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be great dominion indeed. So in this one, it's probably Ptolemy out of Egypt. Ptolemy is Ptolemy the first in this case. He rises up in Egypt, is able to develop a fairly large force. He is able to kind of reconquer what would have been all of Egypt at that time, Israel and Syria, kind of what was the Egyptian stronghold typically, and he expands those boundaries somewhat, a little farther out than that. But it is likely that we're talking about him. The successor would have been this one that will be strong above him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be great. This is basically the descendant is going to be Seleucus. Seleucus takes over and seems to have a very strong kingdom. I don't know how to say that, but they just historically it's referred to as he had a very stable kingdom, which was not commonly true, right? All right, so yeah, let's move on to that one. I don't want to spend a lot of time on any of these. There's a lot of ins and outs of all of that we can look at, but we're not going to. Verse 6, after some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain in his power, but she will give him up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as the one who supported her in those times. All right. Several years. So it's a time of peace, and one of the ways that you often kind of stabilize your borders for these rulers, we see it all the time, especially in feudal Europe, right? You married one of your daughters to a king from another city, nation, whatever it was. Okay, very common way to make those, to make those binds or those ties that bind. And so we have this lapse of 7 years. So it's a time of peacefulness. So we have a marriage that is arranged. So we think it lines up very nicely. The king of the south at this time would have been Ptolemy II. His daughter Bernice was married to Antiochus the second. And basically, not much from them. Literally kind of just fade out of the history books. What do you got?
Okay, well, the woman that went was Bernice,
Mm-hmm.
and she had misfortune of being murdered by her husband's former wife. So popular there.
Yeah.
And then her brother, Ptolemy III, came to power, and now he's going to war against them to avenge his sister's death.
So this was Laodicea. He murdered her husband as well. So the ex-husband.
That happens on 48 hours all the time.
Yeah. So you start digging into some of the specifics of these, and it's like that's a peculiar reading right there. We're able to talk about this, and like Laura said, I mean, we've got intrigue all the time in these kinds of places, and this is how all of this went all the time. That's really pretty specific right there, and so that's what happens. Verses 7 through 9. So after Bernice and Laodicea killed everybody. But verse 7, but one of the descendants of her line will arise in her place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. And also their gods with their metal images and some will say molten images here. So metal, molten, it's a formed image. And their precious vessels of silver and gold will take them into captivity in Egypt. And he, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then in the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. Okay. So at this point, subsequent to the events in verse 6, this new king of Egypt, probably Ptolemy III, is going to prevail in a military campaign over the north, which would be Seleucus. And as the prophecy indicates, he enters into his fortress and is able to take hostages. He takes their idols. He takes the vessels of gold, and is able to have, dominion basically over this. So the expression that says it's kind of out of it sprouts its roots is this immediate ancestry of Bernice, the one we were just talking about. Okay, so this was her child. And the person referred to, consequently, the son of her parents, her own brother, which would be Ptolemy III. Verse 9 probably it would be, if we were going to try to translate it maybe a little better, it said, "And he shall come into the realm of the king of the south, and he shall return to his own land." Jerome talks about this. So we're not the only people who have studied this passage. Jerome, nearly 2,000 years ago, also looked at this and basically talks about Ptolemy and also offers this same understanding. That Ptolemy came up out of the south and attacked the province in the north that would be Seleucus, and together with his mother, so Seleucus and his mother were ruling in Syria, and he took over their land. He took over Syria and that land, and carried off a large amount of money. It says 40,000 talents of silver, as well as all other special images. So this was historically known, even back several hundred years ago, 1,000 years ago, a couple thousand years ago. So it is one of those that, again, marks a specific type of occurrence. We've named a particular person. This is the offspring of the one who had been involved in all the intrigue, Bernice. That son goes up to the north and conquers them and carries off their treasures, basically. And historically, we can prove that that is exactly what happened. We have documents that do show us that that was what happened. All right? So, we go to verse 10. 10 through 19 is a little bit longer section. So I'm not going to read this. We're going to skip through some of that reading on this one. Right? What we have here, Seleucus had returned attack to the south and tried to go back. He doesn't do that. But his successor is described as his son here, probably actually a grandson, Seleucus III, becomes fairly strong. And he's able to approach the Egyptians, and the prophecy was fulfilled that the multitude of the Syrians was given into the hands of the Egyptians. He's going to try to go down south and attack, but it doesn't work out for him. Okay, even though he had raised a fairly robust army. In verse 12, the Egyptian monarch was too indolent to pursue his advantage, though. He could have chased him into the desert and kind of wiped him out, but he does not. And so you have a time period where there's some peace between the southern Egypt and Syria. In about 201 BC, Antiochus managed to assemble another great army and began another series of attacks, as described in verses 13 through 16. And he basically harasses from Syria, harasses Egypt to the south. And then ultimately the whole series of events is fulfilled. Antiochus the Great begins to suffer from these attacks. They don't go well for him. And where it says in verse 18, the prince for his own behalf refers to probably a Roman council. So the Romans are starting to come to power at this time. And he doesn't have anything to do with them, approaches him, and things definitely don't go well for him after that. Romans, as you know, pretty good army and take over things throughout that world. Okay, so like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You can go back and look at all the details on that if you want to. 11:20. This one's kind of my favorite just because it's a one-verse deal, but it's very specific. So after all those guys fall out of place, then in his place one will arise who will ascend to be the oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom. Yet within a few days he will be shattered through neither in anger nor in battle. One specific guy kind of falls into this place. So after Seleucid, in the time of Antiochus the Great, there's a guy that is known as the tax collector. It's kind of the shorthand version of it. He went into Jerusalem and into this neighborhood, and he gathered up all the treasures he could. He's named as Helodorus in 2 Maccabees chapter 2 and verse 7. The Maccabees, if you've ever had a Bible, it's like, what are all these extra books in between the Old Testament and the New Testament? So it's the Maccabees are a couple of the books that are found in there, and they have some historically accurate information. We've not ever considered them scripture. They are some historical books, though, that have some really interesting pieces in them. So it says, soon after Helodorus was dispatched to plunder the temple, Seleucus was suddenly removed. He just kind of disappears out of this because he went a little beyond, I think, his goal there, and so he falls out. But he was known as the tax collector, and that's what you have here. It talks about the jewel. So this was the place where they had their wealth and their treasure, and he tries to strip it out. 21 through 23, you've got, and on his place a despicable person will arise, from whom honor of kinship has not been conferred, but he will come out of a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue, and the overflowing forces will be flooded away from him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after the alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power by a small force of people. So, this is probably Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes typically is what he's known as. Probably referred to as the little horn in Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14. He takes over in the declining days of the Syrians. What we know about him is that he was not of any of the lines to take over the kingship. You know, we typically do that as an heir. The king passes it on to his son, that son passes it on to the next son, so on and so forth. This guy doesn't seem to have any connections with the ruling folks. It seems that he literally by intrigue, as it says here in these verses, he was the one who was able to take over power by either murdering or influencing his place into that position. And then he becomes the focus of this. He's not a great king in the historical perspective. He's not really anything at all. Little horn. He doesn't have a big impact on the world. But it's through him that we're going to see the temple desecrated. I think the reference that we have in about a lot of the horrible things that are taking place are going to refer back to him. He is going to stop the sacrifices in the temple. He's going to make his own sacrifices in there. He's going to strip the temple of its treasures.
What was his sacrifice on the steps of the temple was what?
Pigs, by the way.
Oh, yes. And to the Jews, that was the worst thing you could do.
Yeah. Okay, so we have him go on down and all the way down through verse 29, and then the Romans are going to show up. In 29 through 31, you've got Antiochus is going to be opposed, but continues to persecute the Jews. And through that, we have the abomination of desecration that Christ refers to, Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, I think is connected to this. I talked about that previously. I think we're seeing those things that took place. All right. Israel is going to continue to be persecuted throughout this time, and through verse 35, you have this persecution that continues to take place. All right. I know I flew through that. I threw a lot of names and numbers and all that kind of stuff out there. And I just was, this was my goal. And maybe I accomplished it with that. We read that prophecy. And it is specific. You can go and read many commentaries about, what is going on there. The names that I just threw out there, if you go back and you can kind of refer to them, these are the ones that most commentators agree. There's very little difference, really, in historical evaluation of who's being referred to. It is God showing that He knows exactly what is going to happen. He's very clear on the picture that it's happening. And it's given as an evidence to us. It's given as evidence that God knows everything that's going on in this world. It doesn't ever talk about Him raising to power anybody in these verses. It doesn't ever say something like that, where God was using somebody, raising somebody. He is just simply showing you that He knows exactly what's going on in our world. He knows it all the time. He knows what's going to happen to you and I. He knows what's going to happen to our children, our grandchildren, if they should, even become, because maybe He's got a plan to take us all away by then. But God is in full understanding of what's happening in our lives. And the point of that is just to say this. God knows you're suffering. He knows that the Jews are going to suffer. He tells them that these are the things that are going to happen. And there's going to be wars, and there's going to be all these terrible things that take place. And, so with that, some people will ask, well, why would a loving God allow all these terrible, bad things to happen? It's always a hard thing to wrestle with, isn't it? Why does God allow so many bad things to happen? If He knows about all this, why don't He step in and do something about it? Why does this God of love not reach His hand into this? If He could affect some change in this, why doesn't He? Again, that's the whole point of the Old Testament. To set up the whole purpose that God has been. It was like, I am doing something. And so we see Jesus Christ enter into our world really kind of at the end of this prophecy right here. We end our prophecy at about 180 BC. So maybe 2-3 generations right before Jesus enters into our world. We kind of stop our prophecy. And because I think you do get to the end and think, well, why aren't you doing something about it, God? And I think what we have is a baby born in Bethlehem that God says, I am doing something about it. And here it is. It's not what we expected. It's not probably the way you or I would fix the problem. But it was God's plan. That was how He was going to fix the problem. It's how He has fixed the problem. And so we still see bad things happen in our world. We still see people do horrible things, and we still go to war. And we still worry about, what the next terrible thing is going to be. But we're also given this incredible hope about what He's promised us for the next step. So He gives a prophecy to show, I know what these things are, and He verifies it, and it becomes real clear in this picture about who all these people are. But then when we get past that, we say, God did have an answer. He knew what was going on. He did have an answer. He does care, and He has provided a solution. And that becomes the gospel message. All right. We don't have time to talk about it tonight. We may talk about it just real briefly next week. What happens after verse 36 is a much more vague picture about a king who is going to rule over the whole world. It becomes real similar to the picture that is painted in Revelation. It feels like it is talking about truly the end times. And we no longer have historical, verifiable figures and facts, but rather something that probably jumps way into our future, something that we haven't even seen yet and may not ever see ourselves, but reaches out into that distant future. The things that we would really call end times, like the real end of times. And so there's some unique things that happen in that. But the message still becomes that God sees what's going on out here. We've seen all the historical stuff that's coming, and there's going to be a lot more yet to come, right? But we kind of had the middle piece, so that's where Daniel transitions for us, because we're going to leap over what we know to be the solution in that. But I don't want us to think that God doesn't care. I think that the purpose is, in fact, just the opposite, to say, I see all these things, and so for Daniel, as he's looking to the future, he hasn't seen the solution yet, but God has given us that in the person of Jesus Christ. So with that, let's pray and give thanks to God that he has cared so much that he would do that for us. Father God, we do thank you that you have provided us these evidences, the understanding that you know our world. Father, we look around us and we sometimes wonder, why do so many bad things happen? Why are there so many injurious things that are done? Why do we hurt each other in the ways that we do? Father, we know that it hurts you as well. And so with that, you have had a plan all along. That Jesus came into our world, that he suffered and died on a cross, and by your power he was raised from that grave. That we might have a new hope and a new life in him. Father, our hope is that we will dwell with you forever. We long for that day when these terrible things would be removed, when we will dwell with you in eternal holiness. I pray, Father, that you would bring that day soon. Father, for our friends and our family, those that we need to reach, help us be diligent to take this message of love and care, that we might help them and save them. Father, we ask these things in Jesus' holy name.